I wasn't asking for any verbal thing, I was asking more for a physical reaction, but, you know, if Your Honor feels that's out the limits, I'll withdraw the question.
But I think specifically the question was what was,
How did he react upon seeing the video? I wasn't asking for any statement or anything, just how did he react? I believe the answer would be there was no reaction.
Well, there's verbal and nonverbal communication, but actually this witness previously provided a statement that Mr. Slager got on his cell phone and was typing communication, which we now know to be false. I don't think any question should be asked of this witness regarding what Mr. Slager did on seeing the video. So
No,
it's verbal or non-verbal communication.
it sounds like a Doyle v. Ohio type issue, which precludes the state from offering evidence regarding his silence, post-arrest silence.
I'll withdraw the question, Your Honor.
The argument is that they intended to arrest him anyway, but he's agreed to withdraw the question. That solves the issue.
Thank you.
All right. Let's take a 2-minute stretch and then we'll bring the jury. You can start getting the jury, I believe. The last question is withdrawn. You may
That's
proceed.
correct, Your Honor. I believe at that point the interview ended, and what did you and Agent Peterson do?
I previously received a phone call instructing us to take the defendant into custody and charge him with murder, which we then proceeded to do.
Okay, and that's what y'all did?
Yes.
Pardon the court's adjourned. And who called you?
Captain Ryan Neal, I'm a sled captain in our region.
Okay. And he called you while you were at Mr. Ayler's office?
Yes, the second time.
Could you please answer any questions Mr. Savage may have for you?
Yes.
By the defense.
Please,
Yes.
good afternoon, Lieutenant.
Good afternoon, sir.
Based on what we heard earlier in response to Mr. Durant's questions, your role in the investigation of this case was mainly the interview of Officer Slager, is that correct?
That was a large part of my role. I also conducted other interviews of other witnesses and reviewed the documentation in the file.
So, did you have anything to do with the crime scene evidence?
No, I did not go to the crime scene on the day of the incident.
Following the incident on April 4th, did you have any
To track an individual item.
So that if you were looking for Officer Slager's vest that he wore that day, there's a serial number.
Yes, if there's an associated number that will allow you to find that item, yes.
So there's no excuse in the world not to know, correct?
I don't know under what circumstances it wasn't taken or where it ended up.
Is that vest, Mr. Durant was asking you about the vest, is that vest the same type of vest that would have been worn by Officer Slager that day?
I don't know for certain of this brand or make exactly, if it's the same type.
But effectively, it provides the same protection to a police officer, is that correct?
It is a level 3A holster, and that's a commonly issued level.
Protects against bullets fired. That's why you wear it, correct?
Yes, hopefully.
Protects against tasers being used against you. Is that correct?
I'm not certain of the studies on that. I haven't seen them personally, and I've never been tased with one, so I don't know.
You can certainly, in the last 18 months, have tried that out to see whether or not the drive stun would affect somebody when they're tased in the chest. Would you not?
If I'd had a need to do so, I could have, possibly.
And you know that this whole case is not about the shooting, it's about what led to the shooting. Isn't that correct?
The case is what the case is.
And part of that is that Officer Slager was tased with his own taser.
I have not heard any information directed to that case.
Have you talked to Chief of the City of North Charleston Police Department, Chief Driggers?
Yes.
And did he tell you that in his car at 10:30 on the morning of April 4th, Officer Slager showed him physically what happened that day?
I read the statement from Mr. Driggers where he stated that he demonstrated what the defendant was trying to do.
And turned the taser around and pulled it to his chest.
Turned it around and pointed it, I believe. I didn't
At
see
his
the
chest.
I didn't see the demonstration, and I hadn't seen his testimony in here because I wasn't in the courtroom.
And actually, the testimony that you gave earlier about the physical demonstration, there's no record of that.
Excuse me?
The demonstration you told the jury about earlier today, there's no record of that.
There's the record in regards to our notes.
What he said,
Into what who said?
what Officer Slager said to you when he cooperated with you and gave you an hour and 40 minutes of his definition of what happened that morning.
I'm not understanding your question.
Did you write down the details of the reenactment?
I wrote down some, and like I said, we asked to make sure that they were narrating properly what they were doing. If they made a motion, like for example, pushing down with the left hand, we noted it was pushing down with the left hand.
So you did the best you could do at the time, taking notes and listening and watching.
I believe so.
Did you have a cell phone on you that morning on April 4th?
Yes.
Can you record things with it?
Yes.
Can you take a video with it?
Yes.
Did you think that it might be important for this jury to know not what you thought he said, but what he actually said that morning? You record
I don't see a
statement.
distinction. I mean,
Oh, you don't see the distinction between what you wrote down in your notes and a recording on the cell phone that you had in your pocket that day?
we didn't record anything that day.
And you don't see the distinction between your notes, your partial notes of the demonstration that day and taking the video so that this jury could see the video?
We didn't take a video that day.
And Ms. Peterson was with you that day,
Yes.
and she had a cell phone.
Yes.
And SLED's got all sorts of tools and devices in their toolbox to supervise, to observe, to put surveillance on people. And in a murder case where you were going to arrest a city of North Charleston police officer in the course of his duties, you just didn't think it was important.
As I explained, it's not traditionally our practice, and certainly not in an attorney's office, do we pull out a camera and set it down on the table and start recording what their client's doing. We record it by allowing them to do that interview, and then coming up with an agreed-upon statement in their presence, signed saying, this is my statement.
What about the passenger in the car? What was his name?
Pierre Fulton, I believe.
And was he a material witness?
He was a witness, yes.
When he was asked questions, there's an audio and video recording of what he said, correct?
There's a audio-video recording of some of the statements he made at the North Charleston Police Department.
When he acted out like a fool. Correct?
When he gave the statement that he gave to the North Charleston Police Department.
And so, to say that it wasn't possible to record and to document what Officer Slager said that day, it was just your choice not to do that. Is that correct?
Yeah, I never said that it wasn't possible. I stated that we made a choice not to do so. That hasn't traditionally been our practice in those circumstances.
Because between April 4th or April 7th and November 9th of the following year is wiggle room, correct?
Now, I don't understand what you're saying.
Well, there's no wiggle room. If you record somebody's statement, or if you videotape somebody's statement, that's the statement. It can't be wiggled in the next 18 months.
I disagree with your characterization.
Is your written notes the best evidence for this jury to have to determine the truthfulness of the facts and circumstances of the case?
I feel that our notes are an accurate depiction of the interview that was conducted that day. We would have preferred and attempted to get a written statement that day, but were unable to do so.
Because you didn't wait for it. You went in and arrested him before he had an opportunity to give you his written statement. And you didn't ask him for a written statement. You and Angela Peterson took a statement from him and wrote notes. You didn't say, here's some paper, write it down, tell us what happened.
That's incorrect. We provided statement forms at the end of the interview after conducting a thorough interview, which questions were asked, information was given, and he was given several hours from the conclusion of that interview, about an hour and a half before we came back to record that and write it down in his own words and presented it. He was also given that opportunity again after the viewing of the video. To this day, on November, 10th, we still do not have that written statement.
Tell the jurors that, how many witnesses you interviewed.
On this case,
Yes.
approximately 8 to 10,
And how many witnesses were members of the North Charleston Police Department?
the majority.
And tell me one that wasn't given the opportunity to write out their statement before you talked.
I don't know if any of them were.
And all those officers who wrote out the statement before you talked to them, you then talked to them and asked them additional questions.
Yes,
And that was written out.
yes.
But that was not afforded Officer Slager.
I disagree.
Did you give him an opportunity to write out a statement before you talked to him?
No, and that's, you know, when you go to an attorney's office, you don't know exactly what's going to occur. We go to some offices and we're provided a statement and they say this is our statement. And some attorneys allow us to ask additional questions, some do not. Some will email us a statement and never afford us that meeting. So we kind of, when an officer exercises right to an attorney, are kind of to some degree at the mercy of what they decide to give us at that point.
Did you ask him? Did you ask Mr. Ailey? Did you ask Officer Slager if he would give you a statement? Right before you questioned him?
Mr., you asked multiple questions. Which one do you want him to answer?
You said that decisions you made were because it was at the office of an attorney. Is that correct?
That was one of the factors, yes.
Did you ask the attorney any questions to clarify the circumstances of the interview before initiating the interview?
No.
In your interview of Officer Slager that you took notes of, did he give you any concern regarding the legality of the stop?
He did not express any concern, no.
No. Did you have any concern about the legality of the stop?
He stated he stopped him for faulty equipment, and I didn't have a concern with that.
Did you have any concern when he told you he didn't know the race of the individual until he walked up next to the car?
No, I had no concern.
Did you have any concern when he told you that he didn't know there was a second passenger in the car until he walked up to the side of the car?
No.
And did you have any concern that the stop of that vehicle was for no other purpose other than to advise the driver that it was a safety violation?
I didn't get into the intent of his stop in terms of whether it was actually for the purpose of that or for some other context.
But you've had a chance to see the video and you've had a chance to interview Officer Slager. Is there anything that you can think of that was improper in terms of discriminatory practices or pretext stop or anything of that nature of Officer Slager's stop of Mr. Scott that morning?
I don't have any indication that's the case.
Now, in your experience as a Mount Pleasant police officer, did you stop people?
I did.
Did you ever have anybody run from a brake light?
I can recall instances where people ran under certain circumstances. I don't recall specifically a brake light or not.
If you were a police officer and you had your blue light on somebody and your siren and you stopped next to them, would you expect that they would run?
You never, any traffic stop, you never know exactly what's going to happen. So you don't ever, you're not necessarily anticipating that every person is going to run, but people do run.
And when one gets a driver's license from a driver of the vehicle, do you know at that time whose driver's license it is?
Not necessarily.
So there would not be anything unusual about Officer Slager verifying through his computer communication or his radio communication the identification of the driver?
No.
And you do that by getting the driver's license number, is that correct?
Yes, and the other information on there, name, date of birth, depending on whether or not the system's up.
And when that communication is given into the dispatcher, you receive information about that driver. Is that correct?
Yes,
Including whether or not there's a bench warrant or there a threat to the officer detaining.
some of that information can be in some of those, yes.
And that information was available to you at 10:31 in the morning of April 4th. Is that correct?
He's going where I think he is, I have another,
I'll withdraw the question for now. The information that one calls in, radios in, or computer communication in gives information about the driver's license, correct?
Yes,
And it gives information about the owner of that driver's license.
yes, provided it's valid.
And in Officer Slager's case, you know that the communication was not returned to him. He had no knowledge of the legitimacy of the license, whether or not a bench warrant was out, or whether there was any other information that NCIC, the dispatch, might have.
Correct.
Because there wasn't sufficient time for that information to come back. Correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
And Officer Slager told you when the driver of that vehicle started to run, he ran after him.
Yes,
And there was some concern about maybe Officer Slager abandoned his car and didn't lock it, secure it properly because there was a gun in it. Is there any truth to that?
but there was concern, there was concern that he needed to secure his vehicle. He said so on the radio
Yes.
afterwards.
Was his vehicle locked when he got out of it?
I don't remember at this time.
And was there any long gun or shotgun or anything in that vehicle?
I don't remember.
And when he ran after the driver of the vehicle, did he immediately, after 3 or 4 steps, call in and give an identification, physical identification of the person he was chasing and the location where that chase took place?
Yes,
It's called the 1080.
yes.
And then did he, as he went down Craig Street, did he say, "Stop! Stop!"
Yes,
And after chasing him down Craig Street with his uniform on and hollering to stop, did Mr. Scott stop?
exactly what happens at that point is determined by, certainly by the statement and the evidence we have there. My understanding and what was relayed to us was that he deployed his taser. It was ineffective, and then he deployed his taser a second time, at which point he was brought to the ground.
Let's stay on Craig Street before anybody got down Yellow Brick Road. Do you know independently of Officer Slager that he said, "Stop, stop, stop"?
You can hear him saying stop on the audio transmission.
Do you know independently of any statement by Officer Slager that before he issued his taser that he yelled out, "Taser, taser, taser"?
Yes, that can be heard also.
Do you have any evidence that Mr. Scott, either when he said stop or when he said taser, obeyed the commands of the police officer?
No, I don't.
And before the, and did you say in your statement that the first firing of the taser is the one that hit Mr. Scott?
The first firing, I believe he said struck his upper back. He believed the right one didn't make a full contact and was ineffective.
Well, 2 things about that. One, the first fire didn't hit him at all, isn't that correct?
It was found on the ground there shortly after where it fell, so if it did hit, it didn't stay in.
And is there any DNA or biological evidence that it ever hit?
On the prongs themselves, I'm not aware.
And the second deployment of the taser, do you know independently of the officer, Officer Slager, that he yelled out once again, "Taser, taser, stop"?
For the second deployment,
Yes,
not at this time.
but you could listen to the audio and the jury could judge for themselves what he said or didn't say. Is that correct?
I'm aware of the one time he says taser, taser, taser. I can hear that on the radio transmission.
And could you hear on the radio transmission, "Get on the ground, get on the ground"?
I can't recall those exact words. I've heard those, I believe, at some point.
And can you hear on the audio a response from Mr. Scott with an expletive deleted the cops?
No, I don't recall hearing that.
You don't recall? Do you know that after Officer Slager shot the second taser that Mr. Scott complied with the directions he was given?
Were you asking
I'm
independent?
asking you whether you know whether or not after the second taser, Mr. Scott complied with the directions.
No, I don't have any indication specifically.
Do you know, based on your experience as a police officer on the street and your investigation at Slager, North Carolina, what this is?
That was the first time I had had that described to me, personally.
It was described to you by Officer Slager, correct?
Yes, it was.
Did you look for any cocaine or any drugs in the high grass next to the fence where that took place?
I wasn't on scene the day the crime scene was examined.
Did you look for a handgun next to the fence?
As I said, I wasn't on scene the day, on April 4th when the scene was processed.
You know without any question that there was a fight that day between Mr. Scott and Mr. Slager. Is that correct?
There was a physical encounter.
It was a Donnybrook. There was a knockdown fight where both of them were flat on the ground. You know that, don't you, sir?
Your Honor.
The objection, legal basis only, the objection is sustained.
Have you seen the video?
I have.
Have you seen the enhanced video by the FBI?
I have.
Is there any question in your mind that there was a knockdown fight where both of them were on the ground?
I know that they were both on the ground. I don't know that I can characterize it as a knockdown, drag-out fight, no.
But the two of them were on the ground.
At one point, yes.
Officer Slager higher than Mr. Scott in the beginning, Mr. Scott higher than Officer Slager towards the end of the fight.
That part is unclear. I know during the demonstrations with Mr. Miles, there was never any demonstration of Mr. Scott being on top of Mr. Slager.
I'm asking about the video.
That's not clear to me from that video, and I've watched it many times.
In any way, from what Mr. Slager told you, from the radio communications, from dispatch, from the radio communications from the car, from Mr. Santana's audio recording of the event, did you ever hear Mr. Scott comply with the directives of the officer?
Not necessarily, no.
At the time that the fight was taking place on the ground with the physical contact, as you would, what did Mr. Slager know about the passenger in the car?
To my knowledge, he knew nothing.
As a police officer who patrolled the streets, even over in Mount Pleasant, low-crime area, correct? Mount Pleasant.
Better than some.
Nice neighborhoods and all.
Yeah.
In a high-crime area, in a CompStat 1 area, would you be concerned about the whereabouts of the passenger in the car?
Yes.
For your safety?
Yes.
For everyone else's safety?
Potentially.
Because the buildup of what Mr. Scott brought about himself that day was an increasing resistance to the commands of Officer Slager. Isn't that correct?
I don't understand.
He went up to the car, level 1, right, use of force, presence, uniform, correct?
Yes.
Level 2, use of force commands. And there were multiple commands. Stop, taser, get on the ground. Was there any compliance with any of those directives?
I don't have any information to suggest there was.
When a taser was used, I mean, taser can hurt you, right? Promise.
Yes.
Was there any compliance after 2 discharges of the taser?
Perhaps involuntary compliance after the second one, but I don't know for certain. There is a portion that we cannot see and verify completely.
Well, you know that the second taser deployment was not effective because I'm sure somebody's examined the electrical components and verified that there was never an electrical connection. Isn't that correct?
The second,
Yes, any of them.
the testimony of the defendant himself was that the second one was effective.
Well, that's.
I apologize,
he said.
testimony is not the word I meant, but the information he relayed to us was that the second one was effective.
Which was not correct, was it? Because you know when an officer's involved in a traumatic event, when he kills somebody, it affects his perception, it affects his senses, it narrows his vision, it has an auditory.
Objection beyond the expertise of his witness.
Objection sustained.
Did you go to the Criminal Justice Academy?
Yes.
Did they teach you about perceptions following a traumatic event such as a police shooting?
I've had some training on that, yes.
And based on that training, you know in a traumatic event of a police shooting where somebody is killed, that there's an auditory shutdown, there's a visual shutdown, people's heart rate is way up, their blood pressure is way up.
Your Honor, I believe this is beyond the expertise of this witness.
Objection sustained as to the form of the question, that being
Do that.
a statement. All right, go ahead.
I'll do that. You attended the Criminal Justice Academy, correct?
Yes,
And you're back for many occasions since your first basic training.
yes.
In the Criminal Justice Academy and in these annual courses, are you taught about psychological and physiological responses following a traumatic event such as a police officer killing somebody?
Good.
I have relevance objection. This line of questioning that he was taught that criminal justice academy has no bearing on what Officer Slager did this day.
The objection sustained.
So, have you been involved in other officer shootings?
In the investigation or
Yes.
other
I
incidents?
mean, not that you would, but have you been involved in those?
Yes, many.
And do you get training for interviewing people who are involved?
I've received a lot of very different training over 16 and a half years.
Do you have any training about psychological and physiological conditions when one is involved in a traumatic event such as a police officer shooting, killing somebody?
I have training on some of those things that can occur under some circumstances. My understanding is they're not exclusive.
Let's go back to the chase thing. Officer Slager didn't know where the passenger was.
Until he got up to the door.
Officer Slager didn't know the background, criminal history of the passenger. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Officer Slager didn't know anything about the driver of the vehicle. Is that correct?
Other than what he was able to observe is all the information I can confirm, all that he knew.
Officer Slager didn't have an opportunity to frisk or pat down for weapons Mr. Scott that day.
I can't state for certain. There's some stuff we don't see on the video. I don't have any indication from the video that we have that he had that opportunity.
So when it's characterized as shooting an unarmed man, that's what we know after the fact. That information was not available to Officer Slager at the time of the shooting.
I can't state that for sure. And again, the idea of shooting an unarmed man is also, does he have the not just the ability of the weapon, but the opportunity and the jeopardy that would go with it to justify the shooting?
I guess in the, have you been out to the incident site?
I have.
And I guess you realize that Mr. Scott was running towards a tree line.
Approximately, yes.
And one could hide behind a tree if he wanted to get a tactical advantage on an officer who was after him. Isn't that
I don't have any, that's not what happened. I don't have any indication that that's what happened.
That's not what happened, but that's because you're looking back in time. It's
No.
not what was in the officer's mind at 9:34 that morning. It's what we know now from your thorough investigation.
That is speculation on an incident that did not happen.
Was there ever a time from your investigation that Mr. Scott surrendered to Officer Slager in terms of statements, or in terms of putting his hands up, or doing anything that would indicate that he was not going to continue on the path that he had chosen to take when he left his vehicle?
No, not until he was shot and killed.
Officer Slager told you that Mr. Scott, when he got up, had his right hand with the taser, correct?
Yes, as he was getting up.
And as a police officer, you know when you're in a close battle that your first concentration is on the business end.
Again, not exclusive, but I've heard that indicated by several people.
And
Yes.
you know from looking at the video and the still shots of what happened that morning, that Officer Slager touched Mr. Scott's hand. Isn't that correct?
It appears from the video that the defendant's left hand is on the deceased, Mr. Scott's empty right hand.
But they weren't holding hands. It was a forceful drop on his right hand. Isn't that correct?
When it becomes apparent his arm is on there, his body language shows him reaching down and grabbing the left hand away from him.
And the body language of Mr. Scott, including his toes, where they were pointing in his hunchback, was in an attack mode. Isn't that correct?
I don't know that I can agree with that. To me, it appears he's turning and trying to pull away to run.
And when he turned to his left,
Yes.
and that's where the shots hit him.
They hit him on his back on the right side.
They hit him on his side. Isn't that correct?
They hit him more on the back. It's not exactly on the side, no.
One was in the back above the clavicle, the rest of them were on, I don't want to say side.
They're on the
side.
posterior end, according to the
But
autopsy.
they weren't in the middle of the back.
They didn't land in the middle of the back, no.
And the taser, on the other hand, when he was chasing him, landed in the back. The prong. Isn't that correct?
The prong that hit Mr. Scott. Yes.
In the back.
Yes.
Thank you.
Can I read the
Sir.
record?
Yes. Mr. Savage asked you several things. Were you concerned about the fact that he stopped the car for this reason? Were you concerned about that? That he chased him? Were you concerned about him leaving his car there? Things of that nature, correct?
Yes.
And you weren't concerned about it?
No, it was not.
What were you concerned about based upon what he told you?
The facts of it that led up to and during and after the shooting.
Because what he told you wasn't what was on that video, was it?
No, it was not.
Because what he told you was that they were in close proximity and he shot him in close proximity.
Yes, that was indicated.
He didn't tell you that Mr. Scott was 17 feet away from him when he fired the first shot, did he?
No, he did not.
He didn't tell you that he knew that Mr. Scott was unarmed because when he was grabbing Mr. Scott's right hand with his left hand. Mr. Scott's right hand had nothing in it, did it?
He did not.
He knew Mr. Scott didn't have a taser because he kicked the taser behind him, didn't he?
The taser goes behind him. It's unclear to me exactly how that occurred.
And the first thing he does after he cuffs him is he goes back there and gets the taser from where it was behind him, correct?
Correct.
And it wasn't where he told you it was it?
No, it was not.
Because he told you it was between him and the dead body, correct?
Correct.
Because that was to Mr. Slager's benefit. Correct?
Correct.
And he says he picked up the taser and put it in his holster, is that correct?
It's not the sequence of events. It's not the entire sequence of events, no. He eventually puts it in his holster, but it's not what he does.
I'm telling you what he told you in his statement.
He does state that, yes.
He said he picked the taser up and put it in his holster, correct?
Yes.
Did he tell you he dropped it by the body in between?
No, he did not. Before he had checked his pulse.
Did he tell you anything about Mr. Scott having drugs?
No,
Did he say anything about Mr. Scott throwing drugs down?
no. And I had asked him specifically about marijuana during the stop, and he indicated there was no indication.
Did he say anything about Mr. Scott having a weapon?
No.
Did he ever say anything about Mr. Scott having a weapon?
With the exception of him claiming that Mr. Scott had possession of his taser, no.
He never indicated there was any thought in his mind that Mr. Scott may have had a firearm, did he?
I'm sorry, one more?
He never said that there was any concern on his part that Mr. Scott may have had a firearm.
No.
He certainly never told you that Mr. Scott was running to hide to pull out a gun and shoot him, did he?
No, he did not.
And as a police officer, are you trained to kill somebody because you haven't had an opportunity to prison?
No, you are not.
Did he ever tell you anything about him having been tased by Mr. Scott?
No.
Did he indicate anything other during this interview other than he believed he was in danger from Mr. Scott?
No.
And did he appear, you said you saw the video, did he appear to be in danger at the time he shot Mr. Scott?
He did not.
And during this Donnybrook, as Mr. Savage described it, did he ever, during this hour and 40 minutes, told you that Mr. Scott had ever done anything to him except push him once to the chest to try to get him off of it?
No.
Did he ever say that Mr. Scott had punched him?
No.
Did he ever say that Mr. Scott had kicked him?
No.
Did he ever say that Mr. Scott had scratched him?
No.
Did he ever say that Mr. Scott had made some sort of derogatory term of comment about cops?
No.
Towards the dog. Thank you, I have nothing else.
Anything further, Mr. Savage?
The vest, Mr. Slager was wearing that vest. Maybe not that one, but one just like it, correct?
One that has similar characteristics to it. Submit.
And you earlier said you didn't know whether that taser against that would be effective. Is that-
I don't know that for certain. I don't have the expertise.
So if Mr. Slager had been tased that day, he may not have felt the electrical impulse.
I don't have any indication that he was tased whatsoever. Certainly wasn't anything he related to us.
Oh, did you want to check your notes?
That he was
See
tased?
whether or not, you asked him whether or not he was tased, and he said he didn't know.
He said he didn't know if he was able to activate the trigger.
Who was able to activate the trigger?
Mr. Scott?
So we didn't know whether he was tased.
He didn't tell us he was tased. In 12 pages of extensive notes, at no point did he ever say he tased me, nor did he say it on the audio recordings or to any of the statements of any of the officers at that day.
Sir, I didn't ask you to give the story. I asked you whether or not he told you that day he didn't know whether or not he was tased.
He said he didn't know if he was able to activate the trigger.
And how did you interpret that?
Just that he didn't know if he had actually had the trigger activated as he was coming towards him.
That would be Mr. Scott.
Yes.
And of course, you all at your laboratory up in Columbia now have looked at that evidence, haven't you?
They've done some testing on a similar shirt.
You know what that testing showed on Officer
This
Slager's
is
shirt?
beyond the scope of my redirect.
The objection sustained.
You said you asked him something about marijuana.
Yes.
That was in the car.
Yes.
So when Mr. Duran asked you about, you asked him about cocaine, you said marijuana, you talking about at the car.
I had asked him during the stop if he had had any indication, smells of marijuana and so forth, and my reason for asking that was to see if that was a concern he had about Mr. Scott or his passenger at the time.
And Officer Slager, as he's running after Mr. Scott, thought that he was trying to avoid